We're now on the 8th lesson of the introductory lessons. There's 10 of them in the book of Job, and then we take up the individual chapters thereafter. This one is on the personal faith of Job. I have a feeling that Job is probably the greatest Christian in the Bible outside of the Savior himself. And I'm sure there would be people that would argue that with me and say, well, maybe Moses' faith was greater, or David's, or Elijah's, or maybe Isaiah's. Well, I'm sure the arguments can go on, Daniel, for example. But what makes me think and hold to the idea that Job might have the greatest faith of anyone in the Bible outside of the Savior himself is because of his personal faith, his close relationship with the Lord. I used to puzzle over a statement in John 14 where Jesus says that as we get close to Him, the Father, the Son, Holy Ghost will come and live and dwell in us. Now, I know many people take this in an emotional way and believe that this indwelling is some kind of a thing like speaking in tongues or shouting or hollering or something like that. And I'm sure that's part of it. But I believe that the indwelling needs to be far more fundamental and stronger than just mostly emotionalism. And this is why I've been puzzled. What does that really mean? Along with it, we have a statement in 1 Thessalonians 5 where it says that we should pray without ceasing. And I've been, of course, a Christian now 73 years, and I've been in the ministry practically 50 years now. And I have always puzzled with this, just what does that mean that we have this indwelling? And I think I've found far more satisfactorily what the indwelling means in the book of Job, in his personal faith. Remember, God said he was perfect. A Hebrew word is T-A-M. 3 times he is described as being perfect. And then he also is described as being fearing God. That demands a personal faith. And he's also described as refraining from evil. Of course, if we really are close to God, we will refrain from evil. And we'll have the power from Him to do so. And then, too, another example of how important a personal faith with the Lord was to Job is seen in the way he took care of his children. When they had their birthday feasts, and there was nothing wrong with birthday feasts, that certainly was a legitimate form of entertainment, yet he was a little bit afraid that because of that entertainment, they'd get a little bit away from the Lord. And he knew how important being close to the Lord was for real righteousness. And so the next morning, he would by number have them come in and sacrifice for them and pray for them so that they would stay close to the Lord. There's an odd word used there. It says, so they would bless the Lord. And that sounds still contradictory. The word is a Hebrew word for bless. But when you started thinking it through, when we leave people, after we've been with them a while, maybe been at a camp or something, we bless them. And that's part of the leaving. So what that really means is, lest they would leave the Lord, and not be close to Him as they should. And see, Job knew that this was important. Most people don't. Most people think righteousness is chiefly a matter of getting along with people, and they don't make too much of getting along with the Lord. But remember, when Jesus was asked by the lawyer, what's the great commandment in the law? And these Pharisees, you know, had 618 laws, and they were always arguing which was the greatest commandment. Jesus didn't hesitate. He said right out, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. See, first and great. And the second is like to it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But not as great, not as first, as to love God. That's where righteousness begins. You know, this, I think, illustrates how we are all enemies of God by nature, because Paul says that in Romans 8:7. You just try sometime to imagine that righteousness all begins with God. And you rebel against that. Your whole being rebels against that. Well, isn't God just like another person? Can any person be the source of all righteousness? You know, that's the feeling that we have. We tend to want to put ourselves on level with God, and where we should realize that we are creatures, maybe the greatest of the creatures, but still creatures. And that the essence of all righteousness is in God, and it's difficult. You need the redemption and the regeneration and the miraculous renewal of the Holy Spirit through Christ in order to begin to realize that real righteousness begins with God. But Job knew that, and he knew it very, very well. And that's what made him so great. Now, this is where he had a problem. See, after he had lost all of his blessings, after the devil had come to him twice, first taking away all of his sheep and goats, and then all of his camel, his oxen, and his donkeys, and then finally all of his children. And then the second time, putting on him the worst disease imaginable, elephantiasis, where his skin became like an elephant's skin. Then his wife wanted him to curse God and die. Of course, the devil promised God that's what would happen, if he sent this on him. And he said, no, naked I came into this world, naked I came out of my mother's womb is what he said, and naked I go back thither. That means not only that he goes naked back to the dust, that isn't what he says. He goes naked back to his mother's womb. He knew that he's going to live after death, see. And he knew that he was coded already in Adam and Eve's genes, and he knew that the coding came out of his mother's womb. So for him to say he's going back to his mother's womb means, well, he knew that he would live again. Not in this life, but in the next life. His coding wouldn't be lost, even though his body was gone. But at least he did not renounce God at that time. What's interesting is that when the friends came then, Eliphaz and Bildad and so far from different parts of the world, and they came together to comfort him, and they sat there for 7 days saying nothing and throwing dust in the sky. Then when he began to realize that he had lost face, see, he was on the dung heap, all of his former glory was gone, then he did leave God. You see, in the Oriental areas, even today, losing face is really unrighteousness as such. To them, their gods are their ancestors. And therefore, if they embarrass their ancestors, see, that's just as bad as if we break the Ten Commandments, because that's their standard of morals. See, their gods are not the true God, but their ancestors. And so therefore, they can never lose face. They can never embarrass their ancestors. And that's the way Job felt, I'm sure. I mean, he sure had that Oriental, psychology in him. And so then he did lose face, and he did leave God, and that's where all his troubles began then. He did leave God, and then he accused God of being unfair all the way through, and wanted a legal confrontation with God to prove that he was right and that God was wrong. And of course the friends were aghast at that. They said, how can you ever argue with God? God is the essence of everything, including all righteousness. How can you ever argue with God about righteousness? But Job insisted on it. And in that point, he had left God. And that's where his troubles began. And it got so bad then, that when Elihu brought him, calmed him down through the gospel, through the love of God, that it made him close to God, then Elihu had to censure him, although he censured him in love, and he had to say in the 36th chapter that he was to the position where even a great ransom might not save him. In other words, Elihu practically was accusing him of the sin against the Holy Ghost. The sin against the Holy Ghost is of this nature, that if you commit it, you've been a Christian. See, you can't commit it unless you've been a full Christian. Otherwise, it's just hardening of the heart like Pharaoh had. And of course, Job, if anybody had ever been a Christian, Job had been a Christian, see? And for him probably to continue to accuse God like this, he might even lose his faith. That's what Elihu was saying. Then, of course, even in all of his arguments with his friends, he always came back to God. He says, my quarrel isn't with you. My quarrel is with God. See, that revealed a personal faith even when he was accusing God of injustice. And that's something we don't always do. We usually blame people rather than blaming the Lord or putting everything in the Lord's hand. And Job showed his personal faith with God, that even in the depths of his refuting his friends, he was always going to God. Always, even if he was accusing God, he was still going to God. And he was demanding that God talk to him. Well, God finally did talk to him, of course, in the two whirlwind talks, and had to show him his sins and show him that he didn't fully understand the love of God, and that he was stubborn and needed a total change in the power of that love. And of course, Job finally realized then, and it came through to him, and he fully repented. He was quite stubborn. I often call him a sanctified paranoid. is very difficult to work with. Of course, that was part of the greatness that God had given to him. He had a lot of confidence, not in himself, but in the Lord. But at this time, he didn't have as much confidence in the Lord as he should have had. And then, of course, after the Lord had tried him over and over again, you learn that this calamity that he suffered was not a punishment but a chastisement. Then the Lord gave him twice as much as he had before. But I think we can learn a great deal about the indwelling, about praying without ceasing, about a personal faith, where real righteousness begins, what makes for great righteousness from the book of Job, and especially from his personal faith, and how that was tested, and how it was refined, and how it's a great example for all of us. Now we want to go on to the 9th lesson in our introductory studies of the book of Job. We have 10, and then we go on with the rest of the lessons, 42, a total of 52, where we take up each of the 42 chapters individually. And this is on the Behemoth. Now we'll be discussing the Behemoth again, of course, as we come to the 40th chapter. But it's so important to understand that this is a dinosaur rather than a hippopotamus, that we like to take it up already in the introductory studies that we have on the book of Job, because it's one of the kind of crucial things of interpretation. Almost all the commentaries insist that this is a hippopotamus, a Nile River horse, or some even say an elephant. Yet it doesn't fit. That's the problem. You have it eating grass. Well, I'd say an elephant and a hippopotamus would eat grass. You would have its bones as strong as iron. Well, I'd say that an elephant and a hippopotamus could have bones as strong as iron and metal. But then when you come to the tail, that doesn't fit. It moves its tail like a cedar, a long tail. And hippopotamus has a little short tail, and it twitches it. And even the elephant doesn't have that long tail. That really only fits a reptile that has a long tail that moves like a cedar, not an animal like that. And then, of course, the thing that really is significant, too, is that it's in the weeds and in the water and in the ferns down by the river all the time. See, there's a characteristic difference between reptiles and animals, where animals, and we're somewhat in the animal classification as humans, sweat. They can resist extremes of cold or heat better than reptiles that are cold-blooded and do not sweat. And so the way reptiles get around that, they're much more liable to succumb to extremes of heat and cold than animals. They like to be in the water, they like to be in the shade, they like to be where there are ferns, and they don't go up in the mountains. It says here clearly this creature doesn't go up into the mountains for food, whereas maybe hippopotamus or an elephant could sometime. It expects the mountains to bring food down to it because it doesn't want to take that chance getting caught in extremes of temperature. And you see, a hippopotamus is not a reptile, and an elephant is not a reptile. So all these classifications fit a reptile better than an animal like a hippopotamus or an elephant. But of course, the thing that's really crucial is it says it's the chief of the ways of God. No hippopotamus or elephant could ever be the chief of the ways of God. Whereas a big brachiosaurus, a big reptile, as the dinosaurs were, some up to maybe 50 tons, 100 tons, 120 feet long or so, they could be said to be the chief of the ways of God. There probably isn't any larger creature than that. Oh, sometimes in the oceans we think there's pretty good-sized creatures, and maybe so. But at least as far as the land is concerned, this is the chief of the ways of God. And obviously, that doesn't fit a hippopotamus or an elephant. Then, too, Mr. Watson, a geologist out of Austin, Texas, has written an extensive article on the Behemoth. And it says there in the King James that his force is in the navel of his belly. Now, actually, I don't think the Hebrew quite says that its force is maybe in the sinews of his belly or something like that. But Watson believes that's a certain kind of dinosaur that has the reproductive organs more to the forward part of the animal, and that's what's described by this force being in the navel of his belly, as the King James translates it. And so we can see that this creature has to be more than a hippopotamus. What really bothers today, although I see that even the ancients had problems with this too, is the theory of evolution, which suggests that dinosaurs lived in the Jurassic and the Tertiary and maybe even in the Cretaceous some, long before men lived. They were supposed to live 235 to 75 million years ago, and men weren't supposed to start until 2-3 million years ago. And so they're supposed to live long before men. That's why the humanists are so anxious to discredit the human and dinosaur footprints that we find down in Glen Rose, Texas, because that totally destroys their philosophy of dinosaurs and humans living far apart. And the commentators react to that. Even 100 years ago, in the more or less critical commentaries that I've studied on the book of Job, people like Franz Delitzsch and Zeckler in the Lange commentary, and Rawlinson in the Pulpit commentary, they are already motivated by evolution then. You can see that. Back in 1980, 1970, I mean 1880 and 1870, back in those years. And so the commentaries for that reason too don't like to admit that dinosaurs could have lived in Job's day. We have no problem with dinosaurs living in Job's day. We feel that God made the reptiles small at first, but they lived as long as men did, and men lived almost 930 to 969 years. And then reptiles are, since they're cold-blooded, have the characteristic that they grow throughout life, at least to an extent. And so if they grew throughout those 900 and more years, they'd get big. They wouldn't have to be made big at the beginning. And then they could have floated the flood out, because the Bible doesn't say that all the fish forms of life or water forms of life died. It appears this maybe what really killed people off at the beginning of the flood was radiation, and that the reason the ark was pitched inside and out was to protect the people inside from radiation. But 3 or 4 feet of water would also protect from radiation. So you can see why, if radiation killed everything on land, yet those things that were in the water, some of them might have been able to escape. And if any of the fish could have escaped, then the reptiles could escape the easier, because they could float instead of swim, and they could go without food much longer than fish could. And so we tend to feel that many of the big dinosaurs floated the flood out, and that they were the major form of life right after the flood, until the animals from the ark could scatter and multiply and become significant again on the earth. And in that way, God provided a form of animal life or reptile life for the world. At least it shows that Job could be thoroughly familiar with dinosaurs. They would have even lived after the flood, according to our theory, and therefore there's no problem in him God here describing a big dinosaur to him. That's the only thing that fits. None of these other things that people come up with in the commentaries fit the description that you have in Job chapter 40, verses 15 to 24. And so we believe that the Behemoth, therefore, is a dinosaur, really, a large one, a Brachiosaurus, Supersaurus, one of the real big ones that existed in the world. It's kind of interesting that seemingly we still have those creatures in the world today. For instance, an iguana is really a baby dinosaur, and it's just that before the flood, in a better climate, these creatures became maybe 16 feet high instead of 18 inches. And then, of course, you could see that they were dinosaurs. And then again, we have the Komodo dragons in the East Indies, and they get to be 14 feet high. And then we have other things around. For instance, I've talked to a Dr. John Look, a man who was a missionary dentist in the rainforest of the Congo for a number of years. And he's quite convinced there are 3 live brontosaurus there in that rainforest, 40 feet long, still living today, because there you have the kind of a climate that would support that large reptile. The natives worship these. They won't let anybody see them. They show them something else. And he hadn't seen them either, but he's now convinced that they really still exist. So all of this shows that this concept that dinosaurs couldn't be around in Job's day is wrong when we even have dinosaurs around today, seemingly. And therefore, there's nothing that hinders us from accepting the Behemoth as a large plant-eating dinosaur. And of course, then God used this to show Job his wickedness. See, this creature was big, so Job was big. He was the greatest man of the East. But this creature couldn't be captured, couldn't have anything to do with him, couldn't change its nature, so Job's nature could never be changed by himself or anything in nature. It had to be the miracle of the gospel that would change Job's nature. And this is what God was bringing home to Job. And then Job understood. Now the commentators don't understand, but Job understood. Because it was because of the Behemoth, and then also because of the Leviathan, which we'll take up in the next lesson, that Job finally fully repented. And then God was able to give him double of all the blessings that he had before. So you see, the animal is used as a means of witnessing to Job. And maybe we don't use animals enough to witness to the gospel, to Christ. Because we get this idea that animals and the gospel don't belong together. And therefore we miss a good deal of the power of witnessing that we might have as God here witnessed. Because what really was most effective in God's witnessing were these 11 wild animals, including the Behemoth. And maybe we ought to learn to witness through animals as we think of the story of the Behemoth. Now we come to the 10th lesson in the book of Job, which is the last of the introductory lessons. And we indicated when we discussed the Behemoth in lesson 9 that we feel we should have a special section in the introduction for both the Behemoth and the Leviathan because they're so significant, also from a science viewpoint, since it illustrates the difference between creation and evolution. The evolutionists don't believe the dinosaurs were at all close to the time that Job lived, whereas we, as creationists, believe that they were. And that's why we can designate these creatures not as a Nile River horse or a hippopotamus, not as a Nile River crocodile, as they do for the Leviathan, but as real dinosaurs, both on land and in the ocean. The Leviathan is different from the Behemoth in that it's a meat-eating animal. It has sharp teeth, and it lives much more in the oceans. It is in the deep. See, those who make it a Nile River crocodile totally overlook the fact that it lives in the deep. And crocodiles don't live out in the ocean. They live in the water of rivers or something like that, but not in the oceans. So we see this as something much more than a Nile River crocodile. In preparing these lessons, we were also preparing some pictures that we could get together for our artists. We want artists to draw us 52 significant pictures or paint 52 significant pictures for each of the lesson. And we ran across some Germans who, about 1978, went through all the inscriptions of a Babylonian, Assyrian, that part of the world, ancient inscriptions, that related to animals to show how the pagans then felt themselves lord over the animals, especially the kings and the gods and goddesses. And these inscriptions would show that. What's interesting, they would always make these animals real small, as if the hunter had no problem in overcoming them whatsoever. And so if they had something that looked like a behemoth, looks much smaller than a pig, because the hunter was supposed to have no problem. It's just the exact opposite of the description that we have here in Job, where these things are so big that nobody could really touch them. And that's particularly true of the Leviathan. Even though it isn't the chief of the ways of God, probably not as big in size as the Behemoth, yet it is really totally unconquerable. It was in those days. There's no way that it could be conquered. And that's why, again, it wasn't a crocodile, because a crocodile could be conquered. And many of these inscriptions show how kings and royal people, and even what they called gods and goddesses, like the god Horus, for example, could easily conquer these things and make them look real small. But not so with the Leviathan. The whole purpose of the 41st chapter, which in 34 verses describes the Leviathan, is to show that it's unconquerable. You can't hit it with a spear or with a hook or with a javelin or with a bow and arrow or with a rope. Nothing will work against the Leviathan. It's far too fierce, far too strong for anybody to conquer it. And of course, actually this was a picture of Job. Nobody could conquer Job either, as great as he was, yet he needed a drastic change, as the Lord pointed out to him. Now, the Leviathan is in the deep, and it is fierce. And of course, the most colorful thing about it, and the one that maybe develops the most controversy about the Leviathan, is that it breathes out fire and smoke. Now, it does many other things too. Its scales are so close together that no air can come in and out. And it makes a mark on the bottom of the ocean or the pond or wherever it is with its scales, you know. And of course, it's exceedingly fierce. Well, what about this fire and smoke? Even in our dinosaur lore today, and dinosaurs are becoming extremely popular today, even there you never find them really breathing out fire and smoke, and not except it's total fiction. Well, there are creatures today that do breathe out fire and smoke. They're the bombardier beetle, and they've now studied them scientifically sufficiently to know that they bring two explosive elements together, hydrogen, quinine, and peroxide, in a combustion chamber. They have them, and then they put them in a combustion chamber, and there an enzyme fires them, and they come right out in pulses. Otherwise, they destroy the animal, you see. And they are very effective against their predators. The predators of a bombardier beetle are ants, frogs, things like that. And all that thing has to do is fire once, and a whole swarm of ants is discomfited. And it can fire many times, and it can direct its fire, and it makes it in pulses. It's the pulses that keep it from blowing up. But of course, that's a very complicated thing. It has to have many very complicated enzymes to direct that, and there's no way that it could develop by accident, as the evolutionists claim. And it's a good proof that evolution, mega evolution and development as a result of the survival of the fittest is totally impossible with this bombardier beetle. But even though there are creatures like that make fire and smoke today, and that shows it's possible, we don't believe that's the mechanism that the Leviathan used in making fire and smoke. There are 6 things that we need to make fire and smoke. One is we need oxygen, and then controlled humidity, and something to make fire or spark or friction, for example. And in a match, you know, we've got sulfur and phosphorus. So that when we strike it, it makes a fire. And so if you have sulfur and phosphorus, you can make fire. And then sometimes you can have something like an electric eel or a firefly that can make electricity in their own way, different from the way we do it. That might set off the spark that ignites the fire and smoke in the dinosaur. But when we look at the description of the Leviathan in Job 41, all 6 elements seem to be present in the Leviathan. It has oxygen when it puts its mouth into the air, and then it has air. And since the scales are so close that no air goes in and out, it has controlled humidity. And some friction, of course, when it puts its head out of the water, but also it makes a light shine behind it, and that may indicate it has the power to make electricity like a firefly or a electric eel. And then, of course, it makes the sea to boil like a pot of ointment. That makes us think of sulfur. And then it also has a light to shine behind it. That makes us think of phosphorus, too. So it appears that we can find all 6 qualifications for making fire in the description of the Leviathan that we have in Job chapter 41. And so it seems to be no problem with it being able to have fire escape out of its mouth. That's the way the Bible puts it. Fire escapes out of its mouth to destroy its enemies. Now, we have these Chinese dragons. We sometimes have dragons also in Europe. Most people think they're mythological. But there were some of our divers in World War II that were working with Chinese divers against the Japanese. And when the Chinese divers would go down the ocean and see a light shining, they just got out of the way real fast. See, that's the Chinese dragon that makes fire. It's still around today, they claim. The point is that when you look at the description of the Leviathan, what it fits best is what we call a plesiosaurus today. It's a reptile in the oceans. Sometimes they're called sea monsters. They're quite rare. I know of 3 sightings in my lifetime, and that's about an average. And yet there's some students like Udeman and Hevelman in their book called The Sea Monster, where they have detailed about 600 sightings of these over many centuries. Of course, when you're out in the ocean, you probably see them more. And they don't all have to be plesiosaurus. They could be other things too that, you know, even a big whale, although a sailor usually knows the difference between a whale and a reptile out in the ocean. But the 3 sightings I know of is in 1977, a Japanese fisherman caught one dead off the coast of New Zealand, and since it was dead and stinking up his fish catch, he threw it back in the ocean, but he took a picture of it first, and that got into all the wire services. And then in 1968, they were fishing off the coast of Kodiak in Alaska with sonar, and on their sonar screen they saw one 200 feet long, which is really a huge one. And then in, I'd say about 1970, there was a contractor, he reported that to me at one of my lectures, from Salt Lake City, who had been building mission buildings up in the Northwest Territory, and he was on his way back on a boat between Vancouver Island and the mainland of Canada and saw one in the morning, he and 12 others. It was 36 feet long, had 3 humps, and had goggle eyes. And that doesn't fit any sea lion or whale. That almost has to be a seagoing reptile, and that's what we would say a plesiosaurus is. And of course, up in Alberta, they've got a plesiosaurus, remade there in that Natural History Park on Prince George Island. In the Denver Museum, there's a skeleton of one made up. I was down in Elizabethtown, South Africa in the February of 1986, and they have some made up there in their museum. The thing is, the plesiosauruses that you usually see in museums today are another variety. They don't usually have the scales that the Leviathan here has, and of course, normally they don't breathe out fire and smoke either. Maybe some of them do. Like I say, there are varieties of them. Now, we like to associate this somewhat with the Loch Ness monsters, because those 2 Loch Nesses in Scotland, and there's another one like it, Loch Orm in Scotland, have an even 45 degrees temperature all year around. And they're not glacier lakes, they seem to be rift lakes. When Dr. Burdick and I flew over them in 1975, why, we could see from the air that they were rift lakes. And that means they're deep. And that means there could be openings to the ocean that we don't know of any about today. And those who have seen the Loch Nesses always remark about them that they stink terrible, which would indicate they have sulfur. And you know, we just said it appears from the description of the Leviathan in Job 41 that it did have sulfur. It would make the sea to boil like a pot of ointment that reminds you of sulfur. And that's why they stink so much. So we tend to believe that maybe they breed in these ideal conditions and then get out in the ocean and get big out in the ocean. And I know of 200 sightings of the Loch Ness Monster. Normally, they don't look like a plesiosaurus. They look like an overturned tub with a head sticking out. But if they're young, they could maybe somewhat change their shape as they get out in the oceans. It's possible. But at least this is a possibility, and maybe some of the varieties, too, that are described here in the book of Job are still with us today. So I wouldn't say that this Leviathan is extinct, necessarily. I wouldn't say it's a Nile River crocodile at all. That doesn't fit the description that you have in Job 41. But I would say that they're probably even still around today, but very rare, extremely rare. Now, why did God use the Leviathan? Well, see, Job was breathing out fire and smoke like this Leviathan, not only against his friends, but against God, when he accused God of laughing at the innocent. He couldn't have been more blasphemous than that, when he said God laughs at the innocent. So he was really breathing out fire and smoke. And of course against his friends too, when he called them miserable comforters and enemies and everything else like that. And God wanted to show him this was bad. And God wanted to show him that he needed to have a completely different attitude. And this had an effect on Job. Job was moved by this. He could see how bad he really was, how much he had sanctified paranoid, let's say. And so God witnessed to him, you see, again through this Leviathan. And so we should learn to witness through animal stories, especially through dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are very popular today. I just was to the Denver Museum, and they've remade that whole one mostly just to feature dinosaurs for the kids. All kinds of things that hadn't been seen before were there. And so let's make use of it as a witnessing method. God did, and who can do it better than God? And maybe we ought to learn to witness that way too, and show people the need of a total change as we bring them animal stories, as God did here through the Leviathan. We're now starting a study of the individual chapters in Job. We've had 10 introductory lessons, and in the 11th lesson we begin with the first chapter. And we're faced immediately with the eternal why. Why must the righteous suffer, and why do the wicked prosper? And but we do have 4 points particularly that are important in this chapter. The one is the perfection of Job that's described here, and number 2, then we have the blessings that God had given to Job, how great a man he was, how righteous a man he was. Then we have the picture of God permitting the devil to challenge him right in heaven in the company of the angels. And then we have the picture too of somebody else writing this chapter rather than Job or Elihu. We think Solomon. And then of course the question is, why must God send these troubles on Job? In previous lessons we have pointed out there are 6 answers to the eternal why. One is that the devil is responsible. The second is that there's some special sin involved. That's what the friends tried to establish. Third is that God isn't fair. That's what Job tried to establish. These are 3 wrong answers. And then the 3 right answers: first, Job witnessing to his friends, 27-28, and then Elihu bringing Job deeper into the gospel, and then God talking to Job in the whirlwind talk to bring him to see the need of a total change in his life through the power of the gospel. Here in the first chapter we of course come up primarily with the first wrong answer, that of the devil, and also the question being brought up, why must the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper? As I study the agnostics that I meet with constantly throughout the world, and those who resist the creation position and try to establish the mega-evolution position, and as I question them, I find usually in most cases their main problem is they can't understand why God permits all the evil in the world. They can't see how God could be good and God and in control of everything and still permit all this evil in the world, and so then they look for other answers rather than to find the answer in the Lord. And then of course they go astray, get into idolatry, get into deception, and of course the greatest deception that's ever come on the world is the mega-evolutionary idea that the world is millions and billions years old and that we came from lower forms of life. Now first of all, we learn how perfect Job is. The word tam is used, which is the Hebrew word for perfection. This is stated 3 times. First, it's stated, I think, by Solomon in verse 1 that Job is perfect, tam, and he fears God and he refrains from evil. Then God says the same thing about Job to the devil, both in the first chapter and the second chapter, so it's 3 different times that it's mentioned that Job is perfect and fears God and refrains from evil. Now, a lot of people don't want to admit the meaning of that word tam, or the Greek equivalent in the New Testament, teleos, which means which is what Jesus says when he says, "Be ye therefore perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect." I can recall when I was touring in Israel in '84, and I was trying to witness to my guide who knew Hebrew quite well and was quoting the Bible quite often in Hebrew, and he and the driver were talking back and forth in Hebrew all the time. So I asked him, I said, "What does the Hebrew word TAM mean?" And I was thinking that if he would admit what it really means, namely to be perfect, then I would ask him how you can be perfect. But he was ahead of me. He caught on as to what I wanted to do. And so he says, "Oh, it means to be silly." But you see, to be perfect is so remote from this world. Nothing in this world is perfect. Nothing in nature, nothing in science, nothing in us is perfect. That anybody who claims that is either arrogant or silly from a worldly, fleshly viewpoint. And that's why Christians have always been called silly. See, the word Christian is associated with the Greek word Christanos, which means to be silly ones. And so when in the early church, people heard them calling themselves followers of Christ, Christians, or they associated, well, they're silly anyway, so we'll just call them Christanos, which means silly ones. And so frequently in my ministry, especially my early ministry, I find men saying, "Well, I don't want to go to church. That's just a place for women and children. No strong person will go to church. That's just a place for silly people and weak people, effeminate people," you see. And so you see, this is a general thinking yet today, but that's why many don't want to admit the real meaning of the word perfect here. Some say it just means coming to an end. But no, it means moral perfection. Now, somebody will ask me then, "Well, how do you know what perfection is? Can you tell me what a bear was like before sin? Or can you tell me what an oak tree was like before sin?" No, I can't. But on the other hand, what it's based on is moral perfection. And the Bible details that very accurately. Half of the Bible is law, and the purpose of the law is to show us what moral perfection is. And we can learn it. It can be learned. And so it's possible to have it. Now, we can't have it by ourselves, but we can know it, and then we get it through the miracle of Christ, who gives it to us by his substitution. So that's something that's real important. And it's related to being close to God. This is why Job insisted on sacrificing and praying for his children after every birthday feast, so that they wouldn't get too far away from God because of their birthday feasts. He knew how important that was for real righteousness and real perfection. Then we notice too that the devil is involved. He is challenging the Lord in heaven itself. Now, there's some people who are a little doubtful if this is heaven. They think maybe that's just a group of Christians coming together. That's what sons of God means, and that the devil gets in among them. But I think most scholars feel that here we have a picture of the angels in heaven having their worship with God, and then the devil comes in. He isn't really supposed to come in, but he comes in anyway to challenge the Lord. And the Lord asks him right here, "What you doing here? You don't really belong here. You know that, don't you? I'm just letting you come in because I'm merciful, and I'm giving you the opportunity to challenge me. I want real righteousness, and that isn't possible unless it's challenged. You don't have real righteousness unless it's challenged." And of course the devil then says that he's been very active, and he's going to and fro, up and down in the earth. See, that's the problem when you're in evil, when you're away from God, when you try to make God out of nature or yourself, like the devil does, then you're never honest, and you're trying to cover up your deception by intense activity. And so the devil is always extremely active, and you can see that here by his expression. So what's interesting is then the Lord permits the devil to challenge him, and he lets the devil take away all the blessings of Job. Only he shouldn't touch his body. He just let him take away his material possessions. So first there came the Sabaeans, and they destroyed the donkeys, and then there was a fire from heaven that came and destroyed the 7,000 sheep and goats. And then there was a Chaldeans that came in 3 companies and took all the camels away, also killed all the servants. And then finally a huge whirlwind came in and destroyed the place where Job's children were assembled proudly for a birthday feast, and killed them all. And what's interesting is, as you read the account, it's very formal. It uses the same words over and over again. And while he was yet speaking, a messenger came and said, here the donkeys were feeding, and here came the Sabaeans and took all the donkeys and destroyed all the servants. I'm the only one who escaped. And then another, while he was yet speaking, see, the same expression is used. Here came the fire from heaven, destroyed all the sheep, all the servants, and I'm the only one that escaped. See, that same expression. Now, if Job really wrote this, even if it was 100 years later, he still would be so emotional about it, I don't think he could be that matter of fact and that formal. And this is why I believe somebody else wrote this, and why I think Solomon wrote it. And that shows that Solomon had a hand. And then, of course, this is prose, the first 2 chapters that give this story, whereas the rest of the book is all poetry except the last chapter and the first 6 verses that introduce the Elihu section, his 4 speeches. So it appears that the prose then might have been written by Solomon, rather than that Solomon added the poetry. I think he just took the poetry from what he had on hand. And so then finally, of course, Job says, the Lord takes and the Lord gives and the Lord takes. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And he didn't, it says very clearly, he didn't yet curse God, or he didn't yet accuse God of injustice. He still had a strong faith. He needed more testing, more chastisement, and that's why the Lord let the devil come the second time in the 2nd chapter. But we'll come to that just a little bit later on. And it shows us one answer, let's say, of the eternal why, a wrong one. The devil's behind it. But the Lord lets the devil be behind it to test, to chastise, to purify, and to refine. And that's the blessing that we can get out of this wrong answer, to see there is some value in it for chastisement. We're now on the 12th lesson in the book of Job, and we're dealing with the 2nd chapter. And here primarily we deal with Satan. He comes in the 2nd time here and brings on the more acute tribulation of the sickness of Job. And then, of course, we also deal with the wife of Job, who wanted Job to curse God and die. And then we deal with the 3 friends coming together to comfort Job. And they, of course, didn't comfort him very much because they accused him of some secret sin. But at least that was their objective in coming, to comfort Job for his afflictions. I think the thing that maybe is most helpful to us is to concentrate a little bit more on Satan himself. The word Satan means an adversary, and that's the word that's used here. The word devil isn't used really in the book of Job. And we have this unusual revelation here that the devil is permitted to challenge God seemingly in heaven itself. We aren't real sure what the sons of God means. It says that the sons of God were together, and then the devil came in their midst, or the Satan came in their midst. So we don't really know what the word, what the sons of God means either completely. There are those who believe that maybe just Christians were getting together for a worship here, and they're the sons of God, and it's a possibility. But the context seems to indicate it's more than that, that these were actually angels together in heaven to worship the Lord, and then the Lord permitted the devil to come in and challenge him, and of course also the other angels, because that's all he does. He challenges all the time. He's an adversary. When the devils fell, we can't really tell. There's always this problem with angelology as to when the angels were made, when they fell, and so on. There are those who believe there was a pre-world, and that when some of the angels became devils, this destroyed the pre-world, and then God made the current world in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. Then they try to find the millions and billions of years the evolutionists always talk about in the pre-world. However, if we look into Colossians 1:16, it says there that Christ made all the angels, created them. The word for create is this Greek equivalent for the word for create in the Old Testament in the first chapter of Genesis. And then Exodus 20 tells us that all the creatures were made in the 6 days. Same 6 days like when the Jews are supposed to work 6 days and rest the seventh. No, obviously, those are normal days. So it appears to us then that the angels had to be made somewhere within the 6 days. They're part of creation. And then Psalm 104 seems to suggest they're made on the second day when the sky was made. And that seems to be a viable thing, that they would be made on the second day when the sky was made. Then the question is when they fell. They obviously were all perfect at first. When God finished creating everything in Genesis 1:31, he said he beheld everything he made, and behold, it was very good. So there couldn't be any devils around yet, nor could there be any destroyed pre-world around, because God couldn't say that comprehensively if that had happened. So therefore, we feel that they fell at the end of chapter 2, because you see, you have nothing but picture of perfection in the first and second chapter of Genesis. You don't have any sign of evil or degeneration yet until the third chapter. So somewhere between the second and third chapter, the devils fell, and then of course immediately they would test and tempt the crown of creation, namely Eve and Adam. And of course then they caused them to fall, and that brought all the problems on the world that we have today. And since that time, of course, the devil and his angels, the Satan and his followers have become adversaries of God. And so that's why God asked Satan when he appeared among the angels, he really wasn't supposed to, but God permitted it. He says, "Why are you here?" And of course, Satan says, "Oh, I've been going up and down in the earth and to and fro." See, he's very active all the time. Because of his deception, he has to be active. He can't rest. He can't have the attitude that we have in 1 John 4, where it says, "Perfect love casts out fear." The devil can never have that attitude, because obviously he doesn't have any love at all, and certainly not perfect love. So he's always fearful, and he's always active, trying to overcome that fearfulness. He can't have that peace and rest and calm that God has and we can have in Christ. And so he's always very active, and you'll find this characteristic of the forces of evil. And then God said, "Well, you've beheld my servant Job, haven't you, who's perfect and fears God and refrains from evil?" Yeah, the devil says. Now, we're on the second time now, you see. The devil says that everybody would give something for his life. Just make him sick. Just take away, just touch his skin, and he'll curse God and die. And you see, God pointed out to him that he didn't curse God and die when all these other things happened the first time around, and that God also says something very significant there. He says, "You made him suffer without cause." See, that shows conclusively that it wasn't any sin that brought these afflictions on Job. See, even today, most people, even Christians, feel that's got to be some sin to bring all these troubles on. And of course, the friends were dead sure that's what it was in Job. And their God says very clearly that that was not the reason. So the only other reason would be that the Lord permitted this to chastise and refine and strengthen and make Job more powerful. And that's the reason we have to suffer as Christians too. That's why Jesus says, "I'm your master," and that's correct. And if I, your master, have to suffer like this, see, you'll never get by without it. Not as long as you're my followers. Of course, you might get by without it if you no longer really follow me. But if you really follow me, you're going to have to expect the suffering too. And Paul says to the people in Asia Minor in Acts 14, we must through much affliction enter into the kingdom of God. And anyway, here you can see that the Lord wants to thoroughly test people. There's no way of sliding into heaven. Now, he tests everybody, or or chastises everybody in a different way. He has millions of different ways of doing that. It's not alike. But nevertheless, every Christian, in what way is ever is best for him, has to suffer. It has to be refined, has to be tested, has to be chastised. And this is what we can see in the way that God permitted the devil, Satan, to come in. Now, this is not the answer to why the righteous must suffer, a right answer. It's a wrong answer, really, that the devil instigates it. And yet, it does show that the Lord permits it. And later on, we can see how it's a blessing, and how it was a blessing for Job, too, that the Lord permitted this Satan to bring this upon Job. And then, of course, as soon as the Lord permitted Satan to bring this on Job, then immediately he touched him with his terrible sickness of elephantiasis. Now, this sickness is something that is, makes the skin look like an elephant. That's why it's called elephantiasis. It's a combination of leprosy and cancer. It's contaminant. And in Job's case, it was completely terminal. Everybody knew he'd have to die. It was just a little time to live, humanly speaking. And it has many boils, a lot of pus, a lot of terrible pain, makes bones stick out, scares with dreams and visions at night. It makes black. If you put a garment on, the hair goes through the garment. If you pull off the garment, you pull off the skin, all those kind of things. So it was very painful, very disfiguring, very humiliating, especially for a great man like Job. And this is why he lost face, I think, when the friends came. This is the sickness that Job was suffering, and then his wife told him, "Why don't you curse God and die?" And Job said, "Well, you're a foolish woman. You know, naked we've come into the world, out of our mother's womb." And then he makes a rather interesting statement, naked we'll go back thither. He doesn't say naked we'll go back to dust, but naked we'll go back thither. See, there already he shows that he knows about the life after death, even though he had talked, as we said in a previous lesson, about the law of equalization, because he knew that he was still coded, and that coding would continue, and he would live again, and in his flesh he would see God, as Job 19:25 says. So that's a significant statement, that he would go naked out of his mother's womb and naked go back to his mother's womb. In this respect, that he would still have that coding that he had in his mother's womb, and that would never be lost, even though he would be in dust and ashes because when his physical body died. And then the three friends came to comfort him, and they made an agreement they would meet. They came from different parts of the then known world, from the Behemothite and different parts of the world, and they came together to comfort Job. There was Eliphaz, who was the smarter of the two, the more adult, the leader, and then there was Bildad, who was pompous, always spoke in grand language, and Zophar, who was rude, very insulting, not at all considerate whatsoever. These three then came, and for 7 days they just said nothing, and threw ashes on themselves, showed their grief. And then first Job spoke, and then they answered, and they developed a giant syllogism, argument with three parts: a major premise, a minor premise, a conclusion. The major premise was that God punishes sinners. The minor premise was that Job has been specially punished, and the conclusion was that Job must have committed some special sin. His special punishment would indicate that to them. But you see, they didn't understand the gospel at all. But here, of course, in the second chapter, we don't have them getting into that yet. They may have kind of agreed among themselves as to what they were going to say, but you don't find that in really what they were going to say until you come into the fourth chapter, after Job had first spoken. And so this the second chapter reveals then, it's still part of the prologue, it's still probably something that Solomon wrote. It reveals the power of the forces of evil and how they operate and how the Lord lets them operate. They can't operate unless the Lord permits it. He's still in perfect control. And I suppose that's the thing we need to still learn, that God is in total control. Now, I had a professor once who says, don't ever ask the question as why God permitted sin in the world, because you can't answer it. Well, yes, that's true. And I've quarreled with some of my creation scientists who think that they can find an answer to the question as to why God permitted evil into the world. But you have to admit, God is in perfect control also of all the evil, and it couldn't happen without him. You have to admit that. And I think in the book of Job you can see how thoroughly we have to be tried, tested, refined, chastised, no matter what, because God isn't going to let us slip into heaven. See how serious this whole business of eternal life really is. And maybe we could understand more fully. It's not for us to question God like Job did. That's wrong. And Job had to learn the lesson that it was seriously wrong. But it's for us to learn more about God. And of course, that's what the book of Job is all about. It teaches us more about God in this respect more than any other book in the Bible, or many other references to it. Psalm 73, Romans 8, and Hebrews 12 are all references to this, and many other things too. But nothing quite as complete and elaborate as we have in the book of Job. So let's study the book of Job just for that reason, so that we more fully learn that God is in perfect control, even of what we call evil. He's not responsible for evil, but he's certainly in control. And it couldn't happen without him. And he knows how to turn it into a blessing. And it's for us to know that and learn more about him so we know how to use it instead of complaining about it. Now we're on the third chapter in the book of Job, which is our 13th lesson. We had 10 introductory lessons. And we're dealing now with Job's first statement as the dialogue commences between him and his friends. And in this dialogue, he reveals that he's gotten away from God. And that's something we need to consider rather seriously, because what brought it on? You see, Job was the greatest man of the East. Job was the greatest Christian probably ever, outside of Christ himself. Job, nobody else was ever called perfect by God like Job was called by God twice before the devil. Job was very close to God. He had a strong personal faith. Job resisted his wife, who said he should curse God and die. So now all of a sudden we find him away from God. We find him accusing God of injustice. We find him wanting to die, claiming God made a mistake in making him to live. Why wasn't he destroyed before he was ever born, or right when he was born? Even once the day of his birth taken out of the calendar, which could be done in those days with the lunar calendar. And he even sort of almost allows the astrologers, whereas later on he refutes astrology completely in the 31st chapter. And so it's a little puzzle to us as to what caused Job to leave God, a great man as he was. I've puzzled over this quite a bit, and I may have not the right answer, but the best answer I've come up with is that he lost faith with his friends. Now, you wouldn't think a man that great would, but you've got to remember the Oriental aspects, and I think he had mostly Oriental psychology. I know when I was in the Orient, in Korea, and Japan, and Taiwan back in 1985, I puzzled over that, and I was with a president of a Baptist seminary in Sendai, Jack McDaniel, and he pointed out to me the importance of the ancestor religion in the Orient. In fact, just before I went there, they had a big meeting in Taiwan, how Christians could face that ancestral religion that's so dominant throughout the Orient. Even in the Buddhist and Confucianist circles, it's strong. I don't know how strong it is in India, but at least in China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, those areas. And this ancestral religion leads to faith. In other words, instead of the righteousness being based on God, as it is in the Christian religion, it's based on ancestors, because they make ancestors their gods. And therefore righteousness is mostly a matter of honoring your ancestors. If you embarrass your ancestors, that's the worst of evil there can be. Just like if you go against God, that's really the beginning of all, that is all evil, the beginning of all evil. And so then they have this face business. You can't embarrass your ancestors. So if some of the students in the Orient don't pass their test to get into university, and many don't because the universities are crowded, there's so many people, they can't take everybody, and so the examinations are very, very stiff, then of course they commit suicide because they've embarrassed their ancestors, and that's the worst evil there is. And I think that Job was motivated by that. I believe that when the friends came, now of course with his wife, he didn't care. He could resist her. But when these friends who came, who were more or less his equals, who were smart, who developed a very scientific and logical and brilliant argument, who were religious and brilliant and scientists, respected people, when they came and they saw all of the degradation into which he'd fallen, everything was gone. His skin was black. He couldn't even be in the village because he had leprosy that was contaminant. He had to be out on the dung heap. And even the cave people came and made fun of him. We'll discuss more of that as we go along in these chapters in Job. Then they decided that he decided that he had lost face then. And it seemed like that's what made him angry with God. Now, some other reason could have been there, I don't know. But that's the best I've been able to come up with, that what really made him get away from God, where he was so close to God before, and now accuse God. He was still close to God, don't misunderstand me, but now he was accusing God of injustice, and that was really a spiritual and psychological way of getting away from God. That was largely possibly because he lost face with his friends. And now again, that's something I can't say that I found in any commentary. I don't know of a commentator that has suggested that, and yet it seems to me to be the most logical reason to explain why at this point really he was departing from God to a rather serious extent. As great as he was, as great as his Christianity was. And it also demonstrates to us that no Christian is so great that this can't happen to them. Look at how bad David fell with the sin of Bathsheba. Look how bad Solomon fell with all of his 1,000 wives and his paganism. And look at the problems there. Even Elijah had, claiming he was the only one left. God wasn't fair with him either, really. Or Asaph in Psalm 73, who said it was too painful for him to think of how the Lord was permitting the wicked to prosper and the righteous to suffer, till he went deeper into the Bible, and so on. So you can see this is a problem, and I think that it helped cause Job to lose face at this point. Well, what happened then is that he now wished he were dead, that he's never been born. This is interesting that he wished a day would fall out of the calendar. We couldn't do that with our calendar. We have a sun calendar following either the Gregorian or Julian. Usually we follow the Julian, but we follow the sun, and it's a pagan calendar because, see, like August glorifies the Roman Emperor Augustus, and July glorifies the Roman Emperor Julian, and they're the ones that be sure to have 31 days, and they were considered as gods in the pagan world. And the calendar throughout the Bible is a different one. It's a moon calendar. It follows the phases of the moon, and the moon is a better calendar. You have normally 29, about a 0.5, not quite, about 29 and a half days in a month. So to even that out, every 3, 5, 6 years they would have 13 months. But you see, you could drop a day out of that calendar as long as you stayed along with the phases of the moon. You could drop a day out of that calendar because they didn't have clocks, they didn't have calendars like we have. Everything went by the moon and the stars and the sun. That's how they told time. And that's what these things are made for anyway, according to Genesis 1. They're made to distinguish between days and seasons and years. And so this is interesting. It shows the superiority of the lunar calendar that the Bible uses throughout. It doesn't use a sun calendar. See? And so that's why I can almost say a lunar calendar is a sacred calendar. A sun calendar is a pagan calendar almost. And yet we follow the sun calendar. We really, I don't think, have as good a calendar then as those who might still even follow the moon calendar, though not many do today. It's rather universal that they follow the sun calendar today. At least Job wanted the day of his birth dropped out of the month, and he figured that maybe the astrologers could curse the day of his birth, so he gave some credence to them, where later on he totally renounced them. This all shows how far he had fallen. And then when he also developed this law of equalization that we mentioned back in the 7th lesson, where he said that when the wicked die, they don't die any different from the righteous, or when the rich die, they don't really die any different than the poor. And when the wise die, they don't really die any different than the ignorant. Then he also points out how the kings build big mausoleums, and then they all turn to rust and dust and don't mean much difference how big they build. Think of how even the pyramids have rusted out and degenerated in Egypt. Think of the mausoleums at Hierapolis or at what is called Pamukkale now in Turkey. They're all degenerated and worn out and ruins. Think of the ruins that we find of Babylon in Mesopotamia, of Assyria. All these ruins show how these great things of the past are now all ruins. And Job pointed that out. It says everything is equalized by death. Now, of course, he knew the life after death. He was refuting his friends. He had a good reason to do so. But it also demonstrates that he was not as close to God as he should be. That's the point. He'd gotten away from God. And it shows that if a man as great as him can get away from God, certainly we can too. And that we therefore need to always work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Now, on the one hand, we can be dead sure of our faith. We're predestinated, and God has assured us that because it's all His work, not our work, it'll continue to the end. And when we're discouraged and everything seems to go against us, then we can tell ourselves, no, God has us in the palm of His hand, and like Paul says, the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed to us. But on the other hand, according to the law, we have to work our salvation out with fear and trembling. See, Elihu in the 36th chapter even said that finally, Job, if you continue to resist God like this and insist that God laughs at the innocent and that God isn't fair, even a great ransom finally won't save you. Which means he accused him practically of the sin against the Holy Ghost. And so we can see if a man as great as Job fell into that, we won't escape it either. We're going to have all kinds of times when we fall, even though according to the gospel we have the promise of predestination, yet according to the law we have to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. And we can scarcely get into heaven by the skin of our teeth. And even Job speaks of the skin of the teeth. It's amazing how many expressions that we find in the rest of the Bible seemingly originated in the book of Job. So this is a powerful lesson for us that we might learn, according to the law, to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. And if a man as great as Job had this problem, surely we won't escape him either. And therefore we should constantly learn to work with the gospel, go deeper into the gospel, study the Bible more, learn more about the gospel, and then we will be strengthening ourselves. And Paul says we should use everything that God gives us. Now, that reminds me of the signs of the zodiac. The book of Job shows very clearly that the signs of the zodiac are made by the Lord. They're not man's invention. And they do give us our whole Christian life if you know how to use them. My point is that many Christians are afraid of it because the devil has so badly misused the signs of the zodiac, trying to tell the future by them in astrology, that people are horrified with just the thought of them. But actually the signs of the zodiac give us our whole Christian life. My point is, now of course we have something better in the Bible, I grant, much better than we have in the signs of the zodiac. because the signs of the zodiac are still cursed by sin, and the Bible isn't, by the miracle of inspiration and preservation. But nevertheless, we need to use everything that God gives us so that we don't fall into the problems that Job fell into, or at least that when we do fall into them, we have something that'll get us out of them again and strengthen our faith through whatever happens. And so maybe we should even use these signs in the zodiac along as we use music, as we use literature, as we use drama, as we use art, use all these things in order, based on the Bible of course, in order to strengthen our faith, so that we then scarcely by the skin of our teeth get into heaven, according to the law. According to the gospel, of course, we can be dead sure of our faith, and we can be sure we're predestinated. You have to keep a balance between these two thoughts in the Bible and in our Christian life. But so this third chapter is very revealing. It demonstrates how the greatest of Christians can fall. And don't let anybody say they can't fall, because Job sure here did. He sure here did. He didn't lose his faith altogether, but he sure fell. He sure had a very serious problem. And we have to recognize that and face that. And we can't say that a Christian can't fall, because certainly Job here was the greatest Christian ever, and he did fall. And we have to face that. But of course, with the gospel, we have the power to overcome and make a blessing out of it, as God did here with Job. Now we're in the fourth chapter of Job, which is our 14th lesson. And we're beginning the dialogue of the friends. Eliphaz was clearly the leader of the three friends. The other two were Bildad and Zophar. And he was by far the more considerate of them too. They were now instigating a dialogue. They came to comfort Job, but actually they were accusing him. And this is because they didn't know the gospel. It shows what a difference the gospel makes. Their argument, as I've said before, was threefold, and they were starting the first part of it now. First premise was that Job had committed, that God punishes sinners, and then Job had been specially punished. That was the second argument. That starts in chapter, I believe, 14. And then the conclusion starts around 22, that Job must have committed some special sin. And then finally everything ends up in chapter 26 as far as the dialogue is concerned. This is chapter 4. What happens here is that they definitely believed that everything depended on the holiness of the individual. In other words, if Job suffered, therefore Job must have committed some special sin to bring it on. They couldn't understand what God told Satan, that God permitted Satan to punish Job without a cause, that it wasn't really because of any cause in Job, anything Job had done, that God was punishing Job, letting the devil punish him, but was without a cause, in other words, was chastising purposes rather than for punishing purposes. And the friends were quite sure this was a punishment, not a chastisement. In this way, they were abusing both science and religion. Now, to show you how Eliphaz in this chapter was abusing science, we would look at the picture of the lions that he gives in verses 10 to 11 in the 4th chapter. Here he describes the lions as cubs, as a strong young lion, as a female lion, as the master male lion, as the decrepit old lion. This may mean that the lions were more common in Palestine 4,000 years ago than they are now today. They're mostly gone from that area. We can learn much from this description of lions for science. The variety of lions is emphasized, and today especially we like to emphasize variety in our science, the variety in nature. There's no hint here, however, that these lions and their variety developed out of other forms of life, or that chance, time, and environment produced them as they are. But actually, Eliphaz was abusing science, even as science today is abused by mega-evolution. He did not make the mistake of those who say lions came out of reptiles. He is picturing Job as a lion. Job was the greatest man of the East. Even as lions have problems and finally become old and decrepit and die, so the calamities on Job show he is being punished and is now like an old and decrepit lion. He's no longer the great man of the East that he was. Obviously, Job had lost all his strength as an old lion, and this must be a punishment for sins. Now, this is an abuse of nature and science, just like our mega-evolutionists abused nature and science when they insist the world is millions and billions of years old and that we came from lower forms of life and that one form of life developed out of the other mostly by pure chance. It's totally unrealistic, can't be demonstrated. It just demonstrates that people don't want to accept God and that they prefer to make a God out of the creature rather than to serve the Creator himself. But of course, now, Eliphaz was not an evolutionist. He didn't believe those things. But he still abused science. He abused this science regarding the lions by saying, well, that's a proof from the lions that Job is being punished for his sins. And see, that's an abuse again of science. Not the same kind of abuse that we have of science today, but certainly an abuse of science at that time. And we should recognize that. And of course, the reason that our scientists today abuse science is because they refuse to accept the gospel and see a solution for why God permits evil to come in the world, the eternal why, in the gospel. See, they don't want the gospel. They don't want to be saved by grace. They want to be saved by themselves, by their own works. They want to brag about what they're doing. They don't want to humble themselves under the mighty hand of God. And in a sense, that was Eliphaz's problem. See, he didn't want to humble himself. He thought he was a brilliant scientist, a brilliant Christian, had a lot of respect, and he's kind of felt he was a self-made man, and he didn't want to humble himself under the mighty hand of God. And that was his problem. So just like our scientists today abuse nature and science and talk about millions and billions of years that never existed and talk about development from a lower form of life that never happened, we see Eliphaz doing this in another way back there 4,000 years ago, where he abused the science on the lions and the way he applied the picture of the lions to Job. But even as he abused science, so he also abused religion. He claimed he had a vision, and he claimed this vision was from God, and this vision said that Job must be a special sinner to suffer like this, that God punishes sinners. There are two visions described in the book of Job. This one here in Job 4 that we have here beginning about verse 10 also, a little later through about 12. And then the one that that Elihu had in Job 33 verses 14 to 16. There's quite a contrast between the two visions. The vision of Eliphaz is one of fear. He saw some kind of vague shape coming by, and it slid by. It made his hair stand on end. It didn't speak clearly. It spoke cryptically, and it said that God, well, nature is evil, everything is evil, so Job must be evil too. And of course had no reference to the gospel at all. Now, then it says a rather strange thing which puzzled me for a long time. It says he even charges his angels with folly. Now, for a long time I says, now how can anybody say that? The angels are perfect. But then later on I caught on how dumb I was. Well, he meant the devils, you see. Even some of the angels fell, and they became devils. And so I could say he was legitimate in that statement that God even charges the angels with folly. Not really the angels, but those angels that became devils or Satan. But you see, there's no reference to the gospel. And God doesn't come to people in a cryptic form like that with all that fear. Because God is a God of love. And so this can't be a vision from God. This is a seance. This comes from the forces of evil. But it shows that Eliphaz not only abused science, but he abused religion. And today, of course, we see this very strongly today when people try to compromise religion with the millions of years and what they think is science and claim that God used evolution as a process to make the world and then succumb to the paganism and the idolatry of evolution and still in the name of religion and try to baptize that. And of course these same people then really don't know the gospel very well, not like they should. And particularly do we have that problem when they insist on separating the gospel and science. Now there's three levels of creationism that I've outlined in my work in creationism over these last 27 years. The first level is secular creation, where we can describe that God created the world and that it isn't so old just from the evidence in nature itself. I was listening to a Robert Gange, G-E-N-G-E, recently on audio tapes, and he points out there's no progress in this world in anything without intelligence. If you don't have intelligence, everything degenerates and follows the second law and gets more disordered rather than more ordered. If you want more order in nature, you have to have intelligence put in. And it's put in. I mean, a corn plant develops into a corn seed develops a corn plant because it's coded. Intelligence has been put into that seed. Otherwise, it could produce a rose plant instead of a corn plant as it grows up. And so on down the line. And so there's no way that you can really separate. I mean, that's the first level of creationism. Then the second level is biblical creation, where we admit the Bible and science belong together, and where we admit things like Matthew Fontaine Maury getting the whole science of oceanography out of Psalm 8:8, where it spoke of the paths of the sea. But then there's a third and higher level, the grace perspective, the level where we put the gospel right into the sciences as well as into our spiritual life. And we find that when people do it, they have always a better science. I see this over and over and over again, that not only should we get the Bible into the science, we should get the actual gospel into the sciences itself. And of course, the people in the science world, they go paranoid on that. I remember listening again to the debate between Sam Kirkwood and Duane Gish held in April of 1977 at the University of Minnesota, when he had 5,000 people out to listen to it. And he said very clearly, anytime that people consider the Bible science books, I'll fight that tooth and nail. That's not true. See, that's the way he put it. He's dead wrong. See, he's made a religion out of evolution, even though he might consider himself a great Christian, and he bragged about his Christianity in that debate. He's still wrong. He's still an idolater. And this is what we call abusing religion, just like Eliphaz here abused religion with his false vision, with his seance that he called a vision from the Lord and was really a seance from the forces of evil. And so, of course, you see, they were all fighting for authority. We had a lesson on authority in the lesson of Source of Revelation, lesson 5. But here again, you see, they did get some things from visions, but this wasn't a vision from the Lord. This was a vision from the forces of evil, and we would call that a seance rather than a vision from the Lord. You know, see, John tells us, try the spirits to see whether they're of God. And just because something is spiritual doesn't mean it's automatically correct. It might be dead wrong. It might be of the forces of evil rather than the forces of good. And so here, he claims this is a vision from God, but it really is a seance. And all of this, again, then demonstrates to us the need of the total gospel. In other words, in Colossians 1:18, Paul tells us that Christ should be preeminent in all things, and that includes all the sciences and all religion. Everything. Not just religion only. But Christ needs to be dominant in all the sciences too. And we've got to get away from this that creation isn't needed in the sciences. The sciences are neutral. They're not neutral. And we're not overcome the problems that Eliphaz had outside of a total gospel. Now, Job knew that. Job knew he didn't have the gospel. He witnessed to him about the gospel in chapters 27 and 28. And finally, the Lord brought Eliphaz and his friends around when Job prayed and sacrificed for them. But the Lord did it by a miracle. They would never accept the gospel normally, naturally. Neither will we. Neither would Job go into this thoroughly as he should by himself. It's always a miracle. And we need then to use that miracle more fully. And we have so much better science that way, so much better religion that way, as this chapter, in contrast, demonstrates.